The early morning sun had barely crested the serene peaks surrounding Tokyo's Haneda Airport when flight JL548 taxied into position on runway 16R. It was August 2nd, 1985, an otherwise unremarkable day in Japan's aviation history. For the 182 passengers and crew aboard the sleek, newly commissioned Boeing 747S, the journey promised nothing more exotic than a routine trip to Anchorage, Alaska, en route to New York City. Many were seasoned travelers, businessmen returning home, families heading for summer vacations, and airline staff preparing for their own holidays. A few were novices, clutching boarding passes with thumping hearts, eyes wide at the fuselage that loomed larger than life. Captain Hiroshi Sakamoto, a veteran aviator with nearly 20 years of experience, sat comfortably in the left seat of the cockpit. His co-pilot, First Officer Kenji Tanaka, was just a year into his captain's training program. Between them, they had weathered typhoons over Okinawa and navigated the jet stream's fury above Hokkaido. Neither imagined that this flight would test the boundaries of the possible in a way no simulation ever could. As the engines spooled to full power, a hush fell over the cabin. Flight attendants performed last-minute safety checks, their practiced smiles concealing any hint of unease. Passengers peered through oval windows, watching runway lights blur into streaks as the aircraft surged forward. In mere seconds, the mammoth jet was airborne, ascending toward the high-altitude jet lanes that would carry it across the Pacific. From the bustling terminal to the eerie calm of cruising altitude, the flight began like any other. The seatbelt sign blinked off after 10 minutes, freeing passengers to stretch their legs and unwind. A father helped his two young daughters settle in for the long haul, offering them juice boxes and whispers of stories to pass the hours. A businesswoman typed furiously at her portable word processor. Her documents held the fate of a multi-million-dollar deal. A retired couple, hands entwined, gazed out at the sea of clouds below, marveling at how small the world seemed from here. At 12:17 p.m., JST Flight 548 checked in with air traffic control over the Northwest Pacific route. Weather was benign, with scattered cumulonimbus clusters far beneath their cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. There were no distressing reports ahead, no signals of volcanic ash or solar flares. All was normal. Captain Sakamoto's voice crackled over the intercom. Japan Center, Japan 548, maintaining flight level 350. A crisp reply came back. Japan 548, roger. Continue on radial 075. Next report point is Korma. The crew sipped their tea, exchanged casual banter, and began preparing for the meal service. Up in first class, a sommelier poured vintage sake as passengers tucked into bento-style boxes of grilled eel, pickled vegetables, and sushi rolls. The fragrance of rice and seaweed mingled with the faint hum of the cabin pressurization system. Unbeknownst to those below the surface of polite conversation, a subtle anomaly was taking shape. At precisely 12:45 p.m., the cockpit recorded a slight but unusual fluctuation in cabin altitude pressure, an event so minor it failed to trigger any alarms. First Officer Tanaka noted the reading, but the gauges self-corrected within seconds. Turbulence? A faulty sensor? The crew opted to monitor, confident no single glitch could compromise their training or the plane's robust engineering. Moments later, a whisper of static crackled over the radio. Japan Center, you reading me? Japan 548, do you copy? Silence. Captain Sakamoto, expecting only a continuation of normal flight, toggled the radio frequency and repeated his call. Again, no answer. His brow furrowed. He looked at his co-pilot, who mirrored the same concern. In the cockpit's soft glow, their faces were calm yet alert. Sakamoto scanned the standby radio. Perhaps the frequency had shifted. He pressed the transceiver button again, holding the microphone firmly. Japan 548 to Japan Center. Come back, please. Japan 548. There was still no response. The world outside remained unchanged. Vast blue sky above, endless ocean below. But within the steel cocoon of the 747, something had gone irretrievably askew. Back in the cabin, the flight attendants noticed the sudden hush among the cockpit crew. Orders were delayed, and the usual clink of service carts was replaced by quiet murmurs. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances. A mother clasped her child's hand, trying to soothe invisible fears. The first ripple of tension spread from front to back, muted, yet palpable. In less than an hour, Flight 548 would vanish from all radar screens without a single distress call, a disappearance that would baffle investigators, haunt families, and spark countless theories. But for now, as the chapter of its final journey had only just begun, nobody aboard suspected the role they would play in the unfolding mystery. A gentle swell of ocean rolled beneath Flight 548 as it advanced steadily along its planned course. At 1:02 p.m. JST, the jet traversed the midpoint of the North Pacific Track, a virtual highway in the sky, where flights to North America glide over nothing but water for hundreds of miles. Inside the cockpit, Captain Sakamoto and First Officer Tanaka maintained quiet vigilance, cross-checking instruments and reviewing weather charts ahead. A few minutes ago, they had heard only faint static in response to their radio calls. Now, alarm began to flicker in their minds like a faulty indicator. The cabin had settled into a tranquil routine. Middle-class passengers had dozed off or lost themselves in movies on those early video screens. The galley lights glowed softly as attendants prepared for the halfway refreshments: green tea, onigiri rice balls, and sweet mochi cake. A Japanese businessman drummed his fingers, restless, eyeing the aisle for a last cup of coffee. A young couple whispered about their honeymoon plans in Hawaii, barely noticing the soft vibration that passed through the cabin at intermittent intervals. Back in the cockpit, Tanaka's gaze flicked to the transponder panel. The readout blinked. No replies. He tapped a button. "Try Squawk 7700, he suggested, initiating the universal distress code. The transponder obediently changed its beacon, but still, no acknowledgement from Tokyo Center. Sakamoto frowned. He traced his finger across the coordinate display, confirming they were exactly where they should be. No weather warnings, no collision alerts, no hijack signals, nothing. At 1:07 p.m., the Boeing's primary radar target blinked off the secondary surveillance radar at Atsugi Ground Station. It vanished as though it had never existed. Controllers watched in disbelief as a blip turned into a blank space. Two more monitoring stations along the route, Misawa and Komatsu, also reported that the flight had disappeared from their screens. Panic surged in mission control rooms, televisions of radar scopes flickering like ghosts in dimly lit corridors. Meanwhile, aboard the flight, the crew remained calm but tense. Captain Sakamoto opened the microphone and spoke with a steady voice. "Japan 548 to Haneda approach. Please confirm our transponder code. Over." There was no response. He tried the international emergency frequency, 121.5 MHz, only to be met by silence. A bead of sweat formed at his temple. He pressed the intercom button. "Kenji," he said, "ready for manual comm checks in 5. Tanaka nodded, and together they began toggling between backup radios and even the satellite link. But every channel was deafeningly mute. In the cabin, the absence of cockpit announcements grew noticeable. The galley fell silent as attendants exchanged worried glances. Passengers felt a subtle shift, as though the hum of machinery had gone missing. A flight attendant, Yumi Nakamura, bravely made her way down the aisle, her voice calm yet hushed. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened. We are experiencing a brief communication issue. We apologize for any inconvenience." Her words did little to soothe swirling uncertainty. The father with two daughters darted worried glances, smoothing their hair and urging them to play a quieter game. The businesswoman let her documents drop, staring blankly at her laptop screen. The retired couple gripped each other's hands, the weight of silence amplifying every breath. Back in Tokyo, the government's aviation authorities scrambled to convene an emergency operations center. Senior officials, clad in dark suits, gathered around tables strewn with flight plans, weather prints, and radar captures. Phones rang incessantly. The clacking of keyboards echoed like gunshots. Relatives and news reporters clamored for updates, their voices rising in a crescendo of fear and speculation. Far from the storm of anxiety, however, the Pacific remained eerily still. The sun glared overhead, and the vast expanse of water stretched to the horizon. No flares erupted, no debris floated to the surface. Nature offered no clue to the metal leviathan lost within its bounds. Inside the cockpit, Sakamoto took a deep breath and initiated the first contingency. Descending to a lower altitude to attempt visual contact with other aircraft or ships, he engaged the descent protocol, his fingers flying across the controls. The cabin lights dimmed, and seatbelt signs snapped on with a chime that reverberated like a funeral toll. At precisely 1:15 p.m., the pilots reported starting their controlled descent. Down below, the ocean's surface began to take on a shimmering quilt of cobalt and turquoise, broken only by the occasional whitecap. Yet no ship, no fellow airliner appeared. The infinite blue refused to yield a witness. For the passengers, the descent only deepened disquiet. The gentle jerk as the aircraft lost altitude felt like an omen. The flight attendants moved more deliberately, hands clasped, eyes reflecting the same haunted question. What has gone wrong? At 1:22 p.m., a distant glow flickered on one of the nearby vessel's radomes, a Japanese cargo ship following its AIS beacon across the sea lanes. It hailed the aircraft on VHF, hoping to re-establish communications. But even that faint call vanished into the ether without a trace of reply. And so, in the cockpit of Flight 548, two experienced aviators faced a choice laden with mortal stakes. Continue the descent into uncharted silence, or attempt a bold return to the last known point of contact. Either decision would carry them deeper into the unknown. As Flight 548 descended through 12,000 feet, the cabin's static tension began to crack. The gentle hum of ventilation seemed to warp into a low-frequency rumble that set teeth on edge. Captain Sakamoto tightened his grip on the yoke, eyes darting between the altimeter and the artificial horizon. He spoke into the intercom with deliberate calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. Cabin crew, secure the cabin for possible turbulence." In the galley, Yumi Nakamura and her teammates clicked straps and locked carts, but their practiced motions betrayed quivering nerves. Beyond the curtain, passengers braced, knuckles white against armrests. A flight attendant passed a reassuring smile to a young woman whose face had drained of color. In the cockpit, Tanaka monitored the emergency frequency once more. He whispered, "No traffic, no calls, nothing." He toggled the secondary radio panel, scanning through every regional and oceanic channel. Every push of the button was met by dead air. A sudden shudder coursed through the airframe, like a freight train hitting a hidden rail joint. Cabin lights flickered. A child's cry pierced the silence, followed by the hiss of oxygen masks deploying unexpectedly from overhead panels. "Cabin altitude rising," Tanaka announced. The gauge climbed past 10,000 feet, the ceiling at which masks should deploy automatically. It meant the pressurization system had failed entirely. "Prepare for decompression," Sakamoto ordered. He engaged the emergency descent protocol, banking the jet toward a steeper dive to regain breathable air. Seatbelt signs illuminated everywhere, and attendants pressed themselves into the bulkheads. Amid the chaos, the cabin filled with a cacophony of alarms: cabin altitude horn, master warning, fasten seatbelt light, all colliding into relentless urgency. Strangers clutched each other. Behind her mask, Nakamura addressed the passengers in clipped English and Japanese. "Stay calm, remain seated. Oxygen masks will supply you for 6 minutes, enough time for us to reach safe altitude." Below, the Pacific churned in chaotic swells, but still no other vessel altered its course to help. No radar echo, no radio chatter, Flight 548 was alone. In the cockpit, Sakamoto and Tanaka worked with agile precision, resetting breakers and rerouting pressurization through backup lines. The descent continued, and soon the cabin recovered. Masks retracted as oxygen levels normalized. But the damage to confidence had been done. "It's not turbulence," Tanaka said quietly. "Something internal, electrical, hydraulic." "Too many failures at once," Sakamoto replied. "This feels orchestrated." Below, the few remaining passengers who dared to move exchanged haunted glances. The couple on their honeymoon dialed home on the in-flight phone, only to hear endless rings. The businesswoman's eyes were damp as she pocketed her scattered files. The father soothed his daughters, their once playful chatter now a tremor of whispered prayers. Above the ocean, through a cockpit window smeared with mist from rapid altitude change, Sakamoto spotted no ships, only the unbroken expanse of water. He toggled the sat phone one last time, sending a brief Mayday packet with coordinates. It was the plane's only formal distress call, sent at 1:32 p.m. JST. Back at Japan Center, the screen lit up with the cryptic data burst. Analysts chased beams of information across terminals, piecing together the last known position. But then even that digital lifeline went dark. Inside the cabin, the urgency turned to unease. The knowledge that the world beyond these aluminum walls had lost track of them struck like a physical blow. The hum of the engines felt distant, as though the aircraft itself might evaporate into the sky. Captain Sakamoto exchanged a look with Tanaka that needed no words. They both understood. The next decision would determine whether Flight 548 remained a phantom in the Pacific or found a path back to safety. The cabin lights dimmed as Flight 548 continued its unscheduled descent, cutting through clouds that drifted like tattered sails against an iron sky. Below, the Pacific remained an unbroken mirror of cobalt, reflecting nothing of the turmoil unfolding within the aircraft's steel hull. In the cockpit, Captain Sakamoto toggled switches with methodical precision, rerouting power through auxiliary generators while monitoring the fuel gauges ominously dipping toward reserve levels. First Officer Tanaka stood by, ready to support any sudden maneuvers. A sudden rumble resonated through the fuselage, too deep to be mere turbulence. It sounded like metal groaning under immense stress. The autopilot disengaged itself with a jolt, and the yoke trembled in Sakamoto's grip. His jaw tightened as he manually stabilized the aircraft, banking gently to maintain a heading that would bring them back toward the flight path. Yet every adjustment seemed to invite another protest of creaks and vibrations. In the cabin, the mood had shifted from anxious watchfulness to outright dread. Passengers clung to the armrests, white-knuckled. The father of two daughters murmured soothing words into his oxygen mask, though his own voice quivered. A young woman in row 23 closed her eyes and grasped the cross pendant around her neck. Even the flight attendants, the consummate professionals, moved with a cautious, deliberate pace, as though the slightest misstep might unleash catastrophe. From his seat at the center of the cabin, Nakamura radioed the cockpit. "Cabin secure. All carts locked, passengers restrained." "What are your intentions, Captain?" Sakamoto replied over the intercom, voice calm but firm. "Kenji and I are working to restore full power. We need to maintain control and evaluate nearest diversion airports. Please prepare for possible course change to Attu Island or Nome." There was a collective intake of breath. Attu Island, part of the remote Aleutian chain, offered the only nearby runway capable of handling a 747, but landing there in daylight was still hours away, and fuel margins were razor-thin. Nome, though further east, had modern facilities but lay closer to the polar region, where solar interference could further cripple communications. Tanaka toggled the flight management computer to calculate fuel consumption rates. "At our current descent and drift," he said, "we've got approximately 20 minutes of fuel reserves before we enter minimum contingency." Sakamoto nodded. "Understood. Let's aim for Attu, shorter distance, daylight arrival window. Brief cabin crew and passengers. He keyed the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We have experienced multiple system failures and are diverting to the nearest suitable airfield, Attu Island. Flight attendants will demonstrate revised brace positions. Please remain calm and follow all instructions. A flurry of activity erupted as Nakamura and two colleagues hurried down the aisle, their faces set in determined focus. They performed safety demonstrations again, brace positions for final approach and evacuation, pointing out emergency exits with crisp gestures. A hush fell over the cabin, broken only by the soft whine of strained hydraulics and the drone of flaps extending. Up front, the instruments painted a grim picture. Altitude sensors were erratic. Vertical speed indicators flickered between climb and descent. Electrical buses demanded constant resets. Sakamoto reached for the circuit breaker panel, his fingers dancing across switches that click-clacked in the eerie half-light. Then, at 22:45 local time, a new terror gripped the flight. The artificial horizon failed. The gyrobank indicator wavered violently, oscillating between left and right. Sakamoto froze the controls to stabilize the wings, relying on scant visual cues through water-streaked windows. Outside, the sun, a pale orb low on the horizon, glinted off distant waves, offering Sakamoto the only crude reference for level flight. "Kenji," he said quietly, "switch to standby instruments. Monitor our bank and pitch there." Tanaka did so, voice steady despite the chaos. "Standby horizon holding. We're level at 10,000 feet, heading 285. Maintaining 270 degrees. Sakamoto exhaled. "Good, keep it there." He glanced at the onboard navigator and watched as the projected track curved gently toward Attu. Yet every mile brought them closer to the brink of fuel exhaustion. In the cabin, panic flickered along the rows. The mother in row 18 tugged at her child's sleeve as droplets of condensation seeped from overhead vents. An elderly man in the aisle seat muttered prayers under his breath. Flight attendants moved with urgent efficiency, checking seatbelts and reassuring passengers with steady hands. Back in the cockpit, the dwindling fuel gauge demanded Sakamoto's undivided attention. 40 minutes to Attu, the gauge whispered. 38, 36. He spoke into his headset. "Haneda Center, this is Japan 548. Mayday, diverting to Attu Island runway 07, fuel critical. Request immediate coordination with U.S. authorities." "Over?" There was a pregnant silence, broken only by static. Then faintly, an American controller responded, "This is Cedar Rapids Center. Japan 548, you are Roger. We are relaying to Elmendorf. Maintain present heading. You are clear to divert. Over." A wave of relief washed over Sakamoto. At least someone knew their plight. Yet relief was tempered by fuel readings that plummeted toward the red zone. Every second counted. Through the cockpit windows, the Aleutian chain's jagged silhouette emerged, a string of rocky contours rising like sentinels from the sea. Attu's runway lights blinked in the distance, a fragile promise of sanctuary. As Flight 548 pressed onward, each heartbeat became an echo in the heart of silence, a silence that had once threatened to swallow them whole. Now, however, it guided them toward the sliver of hope shimmering on the horizon. Below the brittle blue of the Aleutian sky, Flight 548's descent toward Attu Island accelerated into its final, crucial phase. At 30 minutes into their diversion, the runway lights glimmered like distant beacons against the darkening outline of volcanic ridges. Through smeared cockpit windows, Captain Sakamoto could just make out the runway threshold markers, their strobes blinking in measured cadence. Yet every subtle tremor of the airframe seemed magnified as the jet fought crosswinds, gusting unpredictably off the Bering Sea. First Officer Tanaka continued to monitor standby instruments, feeding Sakamoto data on bank angle, vertical speed, and sink rate. Despite the failures that plagued their systems, the pilots had managed to bring the aircraft to a steady 3-degree glide slope. Flaps were extended to 30 degrees. Landing gear was locked down under backup hydraulics. Outside, the runway edge lights drew closer with each heartbeat. 40 knots above ref, Tanaka announced calmly. Stable, Captain. Roger, Sakamoto replied. He toggled the landing lights on, their brilliance cutting through the haze. Brace for possible wind shear, he added over the intercom, voice steady but urgent. In the cabin, the lights flickered once more, and passengers exchanged anxious glances. Flight attendants held onto overhead bins, bracing their weight against the aft bulkheads. Nakamura moved down the aisle, securing loose items and offering silent reassurance with firm nods. Even the youngest travelers sat with wide eyes behind their masks, gripping armrests as though afraid to let go. 7 miles from touchdown, Sakamoto briefly lifted his gaze from the instruments to gauge visual cues. The runway threshold, illuminated in alternating green lights, beckoned. Below and to the right, rough terrain fell away into jagged cliffs above churning waters. One misjudgment here would send the 747 plummeting into the sea. 2,500 feet, Tanaka reported. Speed holding, flaps set. Continue, Sakamoto instructed. His grip on the control column was firm, knuckles pale. Every muscle in his body tuned to the slightest vibration. Check local wind data. Tanaka scanned the last uplink from Attu's automated weather station, transmitted half an hour earlier. Winds were from 280 degrees at 25 knots, gusting to 35, a challenging but not impossible scenario for an emergency landing. Sakamoto adjusted heading 4 degrees into the wind to compensate. On the ground, flashing lights on the runway edge guided the crew's eyes, but beyond that, little indicated a safe haven. The island, rugged and remote, offered no hangars or ground crews, no ambulances, no firefighting trucks, only a short strip of concrete carved from lava rock. Nevertheless, it was the only chance for survival. At 37 minutes and 10 seconds into the segment, Sakamoto made his call. Cedar Rapids Center, Japan 548, on final for runway 07 at Attu, 270 knots, gear down, flaps 30, over. Static crackled as the message transmitted across satellite link and VHF simultaneously. A moment later came the reply, Japan 548, Attu Tower, we read you, runway is clear, wind 280 at 30, caution, possible terrain-induced shear at 1 mile, over. The clarity in the controller's voice sparked renewed confidence in the cockpit. Sakamoto acknowledged, copy, we're on profile, see you on the ground. He switched off unnecessary electronics to preserve power, leaving only essential flight instruments active. The cabin lights dimmed, seats rattled as the undercarriage solidified into position. In the aisle, Nakamura tightened her safety harness and placed a hand gently on the shoulder of the passenger nearest her, mouthing a silent prayer. 300 feet, Tanaka said, voice barely above a whisper. The artificial horizon glowed faintly on the standby panel, showing a slight left bank to counter the crosswind. 20 feet, Sakamoto added, eyes fixed on the far runway lights. He adjusted the yoke, easing the aircraft toward the tarmac. Below, runway lighting shifted from green to amber and then red at the runway's end. In the dwindling daylight, Attu's concrete strip stretched like a narrow ribbon across volcanic scree. Suddenly, at 37 minutes and 25 seconds, the distinctive low-altitude wind shear alert sounded, a shrill electronic wail that reverberated through both cockpit and cabin. Wind shear! Winds are shifting! Tanaka shouted, reaching for throttle controls. Sakamoto reacted instantly, applying full thrust to initiate a go-around. The engines responded with a roar that shook the fuselage. Flaps retracted slightly, and the aircraft began to climb. The runway lights receded below them, blink by blink. Then, silence. The shriek of the engines cut out mid-sentence. Instruments flickered into darkness. The cabin plunged into near-total blackness, save for the dim emergency floor path lighting. Oxygen masks descended once more, triggering with a hiss that blended into the universal void. On the radio, Sakamoto's voice returned, strained but resolute. Mayday, Atu Tower, Japan 548, engine power lost, multiple system failures returning, we departing, altitude, unable to, over. His transmission crackled and fractured until it disintegrated into static. No echo returned. The altimeter spun wildly and the artificial horizon vanished from the standby panel. The last thing Sakamoto saw was the wingtip slicing through mist, the ocean's edge glinting below like a mirror. Flight attendants gripped seats as the aircraft lurched, a violent, impossible motion that flung loose objects into the aisles. Passengers screamed behind their masks. For a heartbeat, chaos reigned with deafening intensity. Then, nothing. No mayday call. No fuselage impacts. No debris field. Flight 548 simply ceased to exist, swallowed by the Pacific's vast and merciless expanse, leaving behind only the echo of that final transmission. A profound hush engulfed the cabin as the violent shudder subsided. In the pitch-black interior, only the emergency floor path lights cast an eerie red glow along the aisles. Passengers lay inert in their seats, masks dangling, hearts pounding against the hush that felt heavier than any storm. Somewhere amid the wreckage of sensations, a mother's sob rose and fell, echoing through the empty rows. Captain Sakamoto stared into the darkness, his breath fogging the cracked cockpit windshield. The last telemetry gauges had flickered out. Altitude unknown, attitude unknown, power unknown. Instruments once reliable had betrayed him. The solace of sky had vanished. Only the distant roar of wind and the rhythmic slap of unknown forces against the fuselage remained. In that moment, time fractured. Memories of takeoff joy, tranquil cruising, and determined decision-making shattered against the canvas of this final, disorienting blackout. Yet Sakamoto's training refused to yield. He reached instinctively for standby power, toggling emergency battery switches that sputtered faint life into the overhead panel. A single green light blinked, battery on. Beside him, Tanaka found the glow of the standby attitude indicator, only half functional, its horizon line slanted dangerously. He tapped the instrument gently, whispering, "Stay with me, old friend." The gyro whirred, then settled, offering a shaky sense of level. Altitude. Sakamoto rasped into the intercom, voice raw. "Climbing, maybe 500 feet per minute?" Tanaka estimated, eyes straining. "But we've got no throttle readings. Might be just a drift." They worked in tandem, hands moving in rehearsed choreography, establishing basic flight attitude, applying rudimentary power via manual throttle levers, and scanning for any hint of external reference. Through the misted windows, Sakamoto caught flickers of starlight, and beyond, the vast black sea. No lights, no moon, no horizon. Behind them, a sudden clang echoed through the cabin as a fallen service cart skidded down the aisle. A flight attendant, clutching the bulkhead, whispered, "Captain, passengers need guidance." Sakamoto gathered his composure. He keyed the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We have lost most of our systems, but we are maintaining control. Remain calm and in your seats. Please secure your masks and await further instructions." Murmurs rippled through the darkness. The father sat upright, finding his daughter's hands in the gloom, while the honeymoon couple pressed together, eyes brimming with tears. The businesswoman pressed her palms together, mouthing silent prayers. Each clung to hope in the absence of all else. Above, the airplane groaned as though awakening from a nightmare. The metal skin protested every movement as Sakamoto fought to hold altitude. Without functional radios, they were cut off from any reassurance, yet he refused to yield to despair. "Kenji," he said, voice steady despite the tremor within, "we need to find land or targets, scour for any flicker, ships, fishing boats, oil rigs, flares, anything." Tanaka craned toward the window, scanning the unbroken darkness. Minutes passed in agonizing silence, punctuated only by the muted hiss of residual cabin pressure. Then, a distant glimmer, a faint, oscillating light on the horizon, low and steady. "Got something?" Tanaka exclaimed. Bearing 270 magnetic. Could be a trawler. Sakamoto banked gently, guided by the faint glow. His heart pounded as he weighed the risk, diverting toward an unverified target versus flying blind into the void. The unknown glimmer represented the fragile promise of rescue. "Let's go," he ordered. "Slow bank, maintain gentle climb. Passengers, brace yourselves." As the 747 turned toward the solitary beacon, each soul aboard felt the slimmest thread of hope weave through their terror. Ahead lay only darkness and the promise of salvation beyond it. But as they closed the distance, that promise threatened to vanish like mist at dawn. The light wavered, and then, inexplicably, went out. In the cockpit, Sakamoto's face hardened. He stared into the abyss, knowing that beyond this moment lay either rescue or oblivion. Yet he clung to the only certainty left, the unwavering duty to protect every life on board, whatever the cost. The unnatural stillness that followed the extinguishing of the distant light pressed in on Flight 548 like the weight of the ocean itself. In the cockpit, the only illumination came from the faint glow of emergency indicators and the martini glass shape of the standby attitude gyro. Captain Sakamoto and First Officer Tanaka exchanged a glance that wordlessly acknowledged their dwindling options. Below them, the Pacific swelled in pitch-black waves. Somewhere in that expanse lay survival or oblivion. They banked gently back toward their original heading, hoping to encounter a passing freighter or a solitary fishing trawler that might hear their improvised radio transmissions. But the night remained mercilessly silent. At 45 minutes into the crisis, Tanaka leaned forward and tapped on the sat phone unit, the last vestige of long-range communication. He cycled through the emergency channels, his forehead creased in concentration. Static hissed, then a faint, almost imperceptible beep replied. One single tone snapped between bursts of white noise. He jabbed the transmitter button. "This is Japan 548. Do you read? Mayday. Over." The cockpit fell into sudden pin-drop quiet, not a flicker of response. Useless. The transmission, if ever heard, had gone unacknowledged. Sakamoto exhaled, rubbing his temples. The cabin behind them sat in suspended terror, oxygen masks still deployed, floor path lights glowing like a river of red along the aisles. Passengers lay slumped, some praying, some weeping, none sure what to hope for. He keyed the intercom, voice calm but strained. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We have attempted all known means of communication. We are now flying at the lowest safe altitude to conserve power in hopes of contacting any vessel. Please remain seated with your masks on. We will continue to do everything in our power to bring us home." A tremor of whispered prayers washed through the cabin. A young woman in row 12 clutched her locket, tears pooling in her eyes. An older man, 2 rows back, clasped the hand of his companion, neither speaking, but both listening to the steady click of the cabin's degraded pressurization, holding on to the sound of air itself. In the cockpit, Sakamoto scanned the horizon, straining to pierce the darkness. He toggled the dome light off to sharpen his night vision, then peered out through the windshield, counting stars, hoping to match celestial patterns with navigational charts. But the ocean reflected no moon, only endless blackness. At 46:30, the fuel gauge needle lurched towards zero. The engine's roar had faded to a faint whisper beneath creaks of stressed metal. Every minute in this limbo bled precious fuel. Every second brought them closer to a fiery descent or a plunge into water so deep that no rescue could reach them. Sakamoto weighed their dwindling altitude, the upward curve of the horizon line on the standby gyro, and the faint hum of residual hydraulics. He issued a new order. "Kenji, drop to 10,000 feet, lowest safe altitude, and maintain it. We'll run the engines lean to save what we can." Tanaka nodded, adjusting power levers with deliberate care. The engines hesitated, then settled into the lean burn mode, the manuals prescribed for extended endurance. The cabin's gentle thrum returned as masks retracted slowly, giving passengers a momentary respite from the hiss of emergency oxygen. Yet hope flickered even more faintly than before. A sudden clang echoed through the cabin as a service cart, unlatched from years of normal service, skidded down the aisle and toppled against a bulkhead. A flight attendant gasped, catching herself on an overhead bin. The sound snapped passengers out of a daze. They bolted upright, scanning for what danger had crept behind them. Sakamoto gripped the yoke as turbulence rattled them, a rogue pocket of wind slicing through the calm night. The ocean below heaved in shadows that looked more like mountains than waves. The aircraft lurched, and the cabin lights flickered on for a heartbeat before plunging back into dim emergency glow. "Brace for possible impact," Sakamoto warned over the intercom, voice tight with urgency. "We're experiencing rough air." The word impact echoed through the cabin like a hammer blow. Passengers locked eyes with each other, steeling themselves. The father whispered to his daughters, "Stay with me," and the little girls squeezed his hand so hard their knuckles turned white. For a fleeting moment, the chaos of fear and anticipation crystallized into unity. In their masks and safety belts, they prepared for whatever darkness lay ahead. Then, through the chaos, another sound. The faint thrum of metal against something solid. Not the ocean's roar, but a steady, rhythmic vibration that resonated through the floorboards. A ship's propeller, a platform in the distance. Sakamoto's heart leapt. He banked slightly, peering through night vision glasses at the starless horizon. A dim, pulsing glow appeared, low on the sea, too regular to be random debris. He adjusted, heading by 5 degrees, directing every ounce of remaining energy toward that flicker. Behind him, Tanaka whispered, "Could it be salvage operations? A drilling rig?" "Could be," Sakamoto replied. "Let's find out." The twin hums, one from their engines, the other from whatever lay below, merged into a tense duet. Flight 548, battered and broken, edged toward that distant promise, carrying every soul toward a final reckoning, a rescue that might snatch them from death's grip or a last descent into a watery grave. The faint thrumming grew louder as Flight 548 banked toward the distant glow. Through smeared cockpit windows, Captain Sakamoto could just make out the outline of a massive structure rising from the Black Sea, an offshore oil platform, its helipad lights pulsing in steady cadence. Below, waves crashed against its steel legs, sending plumes of spray into the night. "By the gods," Sakamoto breathed, awe and relief mingling in his voice. "It's an oil rig, likely the Noyo Delta." First Officer Tanaka allowed himself a small smile. "Contact on VHF, channel 16, they should hear us." He reached for the radio, hunting for the emergency frequency. As the 747 approached, its wounded engines rasped in protest, the lean-burn throttle setting scarcely keeping them aloft. The platform's flashing strobes reflected in the dark sea, guiding the aircraft toward an impossibly narrow landing zone. Attu's runway had failed them. Fuel and systems were too compromised. Now, this vertical island of steel offered the only hope. "Prepare the cabin for descent," Sakamoto ordered. He spoke into the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We have located an offshore platform ahead. We will attempt to land on the helipad. It is narrow, but it is our only chance. Please secure your masks and brace for a steep descent. Follow all crew instructions promptly." A murmur rippled through the cabin. Even amidst fear, hope bloomed. Passengers gripped their armrests, eyes glued to the cockpit door. Flight attendants nodded at each other, steeling themselves for the unprecedented maneuver. In the cockpit, Tanaka keyed the radio. "Mayday, Noyo Delta platform. This is Japan 548 inbound low on fuel and systems failure. Request clearance to land on helipad." "Over?" Static crackled. Then a booming voice answered, "Japan 548, this is Noyo Delta Control, we read you. You're clear to attempt landing on helipad Bravo. Winds are gusting from the southwest at 30 knots. Helipad is illuminated and ready." "Over," Sakamoto inhaled sharply. "Bravo," he echoed. "Helipad Bravo, confirmed." He turned to his first officer. "Kenji, call for final passenger brace. I'll configure flaps for approach." Tanaka tapped the intercom switch. "Brace positions, now!" The cabin erupted into tense activity as passengers lunged forward, heads bowed against seatbacks, arms crossed over straps. Flight attendants moved swiftly, double-checking straps and securing themselves to fixed points. Above the ocean spray, the 747 slipped into a steep descent, nearly a 20-degree glide slope, to align with the helipad's limited surface. Instruments flickered as they strained the aircraft's backup electrical system. The external lights of the oil rig grew larger, sharper, then blurred by wind-driven mist. 30 feet, Tanaka called. The helipad's metal grid grew beneath them, its yellow H glowing between twin floodlights. The roar of the platform's machinery mingled with the jet engines, creating a deafening symphony. "Stabilized," Sakamoto said, voice taut. "Hold it steady, steady." The 747's main wheels thundered against the helipad, each tire skidding across the grated surface. The impact jolted through the airframe as the gear locked. Sparks flew off the skid plates. Engines flared in reverse thrust. In the cabin, a collective gasp rose, then crashed into a stunned silence. Passengers clung to their seats as the aircraft settled, nose lifting slightly as reverse thrust slowed their momentum. The helipad's edge loomed close. Beyond it, the icy Pacific churned. "Engines idle," Tanaka confirmed. "Flight controls functional." Sakamoto exhaled slowly, eyes misting. "We're down," he said softly into the intercom. "We're down. Please remain seated until further instructions." Cries of relief and sobs of gratitude filled the cabin. A young woman pressed her forehead against the window, tears streaking her cheeks. The father hugged his daughters, unable to speak. Flight attendants hovered in the aisles, eyes wide but smiling. On the helipad, platform workers in high-visibility gear rushed forward, ropes and nets at the ready. Spotlights danced across the fuselage as they prepared to secure the aircraft. A rescue boat approached on the rig's southern flank, its siren wailing in the night. In the cockpit, Sakamoto and Tanaka allowed themselves a moment of quiet triumph. They exchanged a nod that spoke volumes, of training, courage, and unwavering resolve. Below, on the platform's deck, crewmen set up evacuation slides and medkits. A doctor and paramedic stood by, ready to treat injuries. The elder man in 15B gripped the armrest, tears in his eyes as he watched the platform crew. His wife squeezed his hand, her voice choked but triumphant. "We're alive." As doors opened and slide ramps unfurled, the survivors of Flight 548 prepared to descend onto the steel deck above freezing waters, battered but alive. And as their feet touched solid ground, the abyss of uncertainty receded, replaced by the unwavering determination of humanity's will to survive. The clamor of rotor wash from rescue helicopters mingled with the hiss of platform floodlights as the last evacuees of Flight 548 descended their slides onto the cold steel deck. Below them, the churning Bering Sea lashed at the platform's legs, sending sprays of brine skyward that glittered in the powerful spotlights. Though still shaken, each survivor carried with them a spark of triumph. They had defied the ocean's yawning abyss. Once all 182 passengers and crew were safely aboard, platform officers ushered them into the main module's cavernous hangar bay. Inside, the air was thick with diesel fumes and the metallic tang of offshore work, but it felt infinitely more hospitable than the endless night and silent skies they had just escaped. Medics in neon orange overalls moved swiftly among the survivors, checking vital signs, bandaging sprains, and offering blankets and hot drinks. A soft humming, part machinery, part murmured prayers, filled the space. Captain Sakamoto and First Officer Tanaka remained near the entrance, shoulders slumped but faces illuminated by relief. Sakamoto spoke quietly with the platform's operations manager, relaying the 747's critical condition. Fractured hydraulics, stripped landing gear integrity checks, and the near-total loss of electrical systems. Structural engineers aboard the rig listened attentively, exchanging grim looks. The plane could not stay here long. It was designed neither for helipad landings nor for permanent docking. Inside the hangar, passengers clustered in small groups. A retired couple sat side by side on crates of safety equipment, holding steaming mugs of soup. The father of 2 daughters told them stories of heroic captains and smiling faces, his voice wavering yet determined. The businesswoman, now wrapped in a thick blanket, shared her corporate credentials with platform clerks, who helped her phone company headquarters via satellite uplink. One by one, survivors recounted fragments of the ordeal. The deafening alarms, the blinding emergency lights, the sensation of freefall as the 747 detached itself from the sky. A young flight attendant, trembling but resolute, hugged Nakamura. "You kept everyone calm," she whispered. Nakamura's eyes glistened. "We did what we were trained to," she replied softly. "That training saved us all." Amid this wash of relief, somber duty slowly reclaimed its place. Engineers boarded the 747 under the glare of portable floodlights, conducting rapid hull inspections. Crews secured the aircraft's weight with heavy chains to prevent it from sliding in rough seas. 2 naval vessels dispatched by the U.S. Coast Guard once the distress beacon was triangulated, steamed into view beyond the rig's perimeter, their searchlights carving arcs across the dark water. Back in the makeshift medical ward, actually an enclosed control room converted for triage, a young doctor knelt beside an elderly man who had sustained a head laceration during evacuation. "Your injury looks clean," she said, applying a final stitch. The man nodded, tears of gratitude mingling with fatigue. His wife squeezed his hand. "We owe our lives to these brave men." Outside, the frozen steel air grated against survivors' damp clothing, yet none complained. Each breath was a victory, each heartbeat a hymn of survival. Children, once frightened and silent, now giggled at the sight of platform cats, 2 mangy strays that darted between legs, scavenging for scraps. A few intrepid souls snapped photographs on their phones, capturing this surreal oasis amidst the vast Pacific. At 6350, an emergency meeting convened in the operations module. Captain Sakamoto, flanked by representatives from All Nippon Airways, the U.S. Coast Guard, and platform management, outlined the next steps. Immediate evacuation plan. Transfer all survivors to the nearest Coast Guard cutter by dawn, then ferry them to Dutch Harbor for onward transport. Aircraft recovery assessment. Structural engineers must certify whether the 747 can be hoisted onto a semi-submersible barge or if it must be dismantled piecemeal and retrieved later. Family reunification protocol. Establish direct communication channels with each passenger's next of kin. Issue travel arrangements and counseling services. Preliminary inquiry. Gather testimonies from flight crew, attendants, and survivors about system failures, communications blackouts, and emergency procedures to assist investigative authorities. As Sakamoto detailed these plans, the hum of the platform's generators punctuated the room, a reminder that life continued even in this remote outpost. The operations manager, a grizzled veteran of offshore crises, nodded gravely. "We'll do everything we can," he said. Over the next hour, teams dispersed to carry out their tasks. Survivors were escorted below deck to climate-controlled cabins where they slept fitfully on rows of bunks. Medics administered sedatives to quell shock. Counselors began probing gently for those suffering extreme trauma. Engineers measured wing struts and catalogued electrical fires, photographing every anomaly. Meanwhile, communications officers transmitted detailed status updates via satellite to airline headquarters in Tokyo and emergency services in Anchorage. Though physically safe, the survivors remained psychologically perched on a precipice. The platform's communal lounge filled with hushed conversations. "I can't believe we made it. What happened to the rest of the flight deck instruments? Will I ever fly again?" Each question lingered unanswered, like ghosts drifting through the metal corridors. At 67:15, a lone bell rang on the deck, a signal that the Coast Guard cutter Ayanami had reached alongside. Its flank bristled with spotlights and decks crowded with rescue swimmers and paramedics. The platform crew readied gangplanks and safety nets. One by one, survivors prepared to depart this steel sanctuary for the promise of dry land and the embrace of loved ones. Captain Sakamoto watched them go, chest tight with both relief and sorrow. 4 souls aboard the platform. Those who had suffered injuries too severe for immediate travel would remain under medical care until airlifted. But for the rest, the next leg of their journey beckoned. As the first survivors stepped onto the cutter's deck, Sakamoto allowed himself a tentative smile. They had been saved from the abyss. Soon, they would be saved from the solitude of survival. As the first rescuers from the USCG cutter Ayanami secured the last survivors onto stretchers and gangway lines, the towering steel structure of the Noyo Delta platform receded into the distance. The night air was sharp with salt spray, but it carried the promise of dry land, and beyond that, the embrace of waiting families. Captain Sakamoto watched the platform's floodlights shrink on the horizon, reflecting on the narrow line between ruin and redemption over which he and his crew had walked. Below deck on Ayanami, the survivors lay on cots arranged in the cutter's infirmary amid the hum of generators and the soft hiss of ventilators. Paramedics checked vitals, rebandaged cuts, and offered hot beverages. The elderly man with the head laceration smiled weakly as his wife grasped his hand, tears of relief glistening in the harsh light. Children, finally unmasked, gripped stuffed animals provided by the Coast Guard, their eyes heavy but curious. On the cutter's bridge, Sakamoto and Tanaka conferred with Lieutenant Commander Reyes, the cutter's CO, over a tactical chart illuminated by red lighting. Reyes pointed to a plotted course, north-northeast toward Dutch Harbor, a 240 nautical mile journey that would take nearly 12 hours at cruising speed. He advised maintaining a moderate pace to avoid exacerbating any lingering injuries and to allow medevac planning for the most critical cases once ashore. "Understood," Sakamoto replied. "We'll accompany you and provide any assistance needed. What about the aircraft?" Reyes shook his head. "That platform's not built for a 747 of that size. Salvage teams are on standby in Dutch Harbor, but the consensus is to strip what we can and scuttle the iframes that can't be salvaged. I'll relay your engineer's findings when we arrive." Sakamoto nodded, determination tightening his jaw. Even in victory, the duty of inquiry called. Every gauge failure, every lost radio transmission, every flicker of warning lights would be scrutinized by investigators on both sides of the Pacific. He and Tanaka would be key witnesses. Their testimonies would shape the narrative of what had become one of aviation's most baffling miracles. As dawn crept across the Bering Sea, the Ayanami steamed steadily toward the Aleutian chain. Survivors, once huddled in fear, now leaned against the cutter's railings, watching seabirds wheel above the grey waters. A young flight attendant, her uniform still dusted with platform grime, explained to curious children how the evacuation slides worked and demonstrated brace positions, this time as a lesson, not a lifeline. Below deck, medics compiled incident reports, noting symptoms of hypothermia, mild decompression sickness, and trauma. Satellite communications crackled as the cutter's communications team forwarded data to the USCG district office in Juneau and the National Transportation Safety Board in Washington, D.C. Behind every digital packet was the story of cold terror turned to hope, of 1,000 small acts of professionalism and courage that had saved lives against overwhelming odds. By mid-morning, the cutter's bridge announced, "Dutch Harbor in sight." Cheers rose from the deck as the distant silhouette of Unalaska's harbor appeared beneath snow-tipped peaks. Family members, flown in by military transport, crowded the dock, waving photographs, banners, and tears of anxious anticipation. One by one, survivors disembarked onto solid ground, guided by volunteer coordinators who offered clothing, food, and information packets. The father of two hugged his daughters so tightly his shoulders shook. The businesswoman buried her face in her partner's coat. The retired couple leaned on each other, wiping tears as they took tentative steps toward reunion. Captain Sakamoto and First Officer Tanaka stayed aboard until the last passenger had been transferred to buses bound for temporary lodging. Only then did they step onto the dock, their uniforms pressed but faces etched by sleepless nights and relentless responsibility. Journalists pressed microphones and cameras toward them, but both men offered only brief statements. Our thoughts are with those still undergoing treatment. We are grateful to the Coast Guard and the Noyo Delta platform crew. An investigation will seek to find how multiple system failures occurred and to ensure such an event never happens again. Their restraint in the face of media firestorms spoke volumes. Professionalism forged in crisis. That evening, back in the secure briefing room of the investigation panel, Sakamoto, Tanaka, and key cabin crew gave detailed oral testimonies. Investigators displayed wreckage photos, melted wires, corroded circuit breakers, and fractured sensor housings. Engineers from the aircraft manufacturer cross-examined every sequence. How and why did pressurization lines rupture? Which maintenance cycles had been missed? Was this a freak act of nature or the result of human error? Hours of discussion gave way to preliminary conclusions. A cascading series of electrical failures triggered by an undetected lightning strike near Stairwell 2. A latent design flaw in the redundant pressurization system, and overloaded auxiliary power units that finally surrendered under emergency loads. Each finding barely scratched the surface of a complex tapestry of causation. Yet amid the technical jargon and endless charts, one truth emerged unassailable. The decisive actions of Flight 548's crew and cabin staff had prevented a tragedy. Every minute of training, every safety drill, and every calm command in the darkest hours had turned the tide from disaster to salvation. As the panel adjourned at midnight, Sakamoto gathered his team. In the hush of the closed room, he offered a single nod of gratitude. No speeches were necessary. They all knew what had been won and at what cost. The investigation would continue, but for now, the long flight home had begun in earnest. By the time the last of Flight 548's survivors had disembarked in Dutch Harbor, the sun had set behind the rugged silhouette of the Aleutian Islands, leaving a violet twilight that mirrored the solemn mood ashore. In a hastily converted conference room at the local community center, rows of plastic chairs were arranged in a semicircle. On one side sat family members, aid workers, and reporters. On the other, the survivors themselves, still wearing their air sickness bracelets and warm blankets, their faces pale but determined. A makeshift podium bore a single microphone. Behind it stood the flight attendants, their uniforms still marked by salt spray and diesel soot. Yumi Nakamura stepped forward first. Her voice was steady but soft. 75 minutes ago, we were defying the open Pacific, praying that our training would be enough. Today we stand here because every member of this crew acted without hesitation, securing carts, demonstrating brace positions, comforting children in the dark. We did not know if the lights would come back on, but we knew our duty would never fail us. Applause rippled through the room as Nakamura returned to her seat. Next came First Officer Kenji Tanaka, voice more reserved but equally earnest. Captain Sakamoto and I faced failures no simulator could replicate. Lost comms, exploding alarms, an artificial horizon that betrayed us at the last moment. Yet we landed on a helipad in the middle of the Bering Sea. It was not skill alone that saved us, but the confidence born of discipline, of trust in each other, and in every soul aboard. We owe our lives to the passenger who kept calm, to the attendants who held firm, even when their knees shook. A hush fell as the final speaker rose, Captain Hiroshi Sakamoto. He cleared his throat before addressing the assembled families and media. To the families who waited, unsure if your loved ones would return, I promise you, every decision made in the sky was guided by the simple principle of do no harm. We pushed this aircraft beyond its limits because that was our only path home. We will never forget the faces in those windows. Fear, hope, then relief. I carry them with me always. As Sakamoto stepped down, survivors mingled with relatives, hugs and tears, relief and the heavy weight of unspoken questions. A mother thanked Nakamura for keeping her infant calm. A businessman clasped Tanaka's hand, voice unsteady. "Without your calm, I would have..." His words faltered, but the gratitude was clear. Later that evening, a small group gathered around a projector in the corner, reviewing grainy cockpit footage recovered from the standby recorder. They watched the flicker of warning lights, the static blurred transmissions, and the moment the 747's wheels touched the oil rig's helipad. For many, it was the first time they saw the chaos they had only felt. A teenage survivor, eyes wide, whispered, "I didn't know it was that close." Though they celebrated survival, the psychological impact could not be ignored. Counselors offered one-on-one sessions, some refused, retelling their stories instead. The retired couple confided nightmares of black screens. The young honeymooners admitted they could no longer look at the sky without their hearts racing. Yet each in their own way processed the trauma, through tears, through laughter at absurd moments. "I remember the cat," a flight attendant chuckled, through quiet reflection. As midnight approached, families escorted their loved ones home in vans, marked community support. The conference room emptied, leaving behind discarded coffee cups, crumpled tissue, and the lingering hum of overhead fluorescents. Nakamura lingered last, gazing at the empty chairs. She whispered to the silent room, "We told their stories, but now we must live with ours." She switched off the projector and walked into the night, each step echoing with gratitude and the burden of memory. The aftermath of Flight 548's miraculous rescue rippled far beyond the icy waters of the Bering Sea. In the weeks that followed, aviation authorities in Japan and the United States convened joint safety committees. At a high-security facility near Tokyo's Haneda Airport, engineers and regulators pored over wreckage photos, cockpit voice recordings, and the cabin crew's testimony. They sought to distill lessons from every system glitch. Whether a corroded lightning arrestor, a microcrack in a hydraulic line, or a software bug in the emergency pressurization override. Within 2 months, new directives emerged. Supplemental inspections for redundant pressurization hoses, enhanced shielding for critical avionics, and updated training modules simulating total system blackouts. The International Civil Aviation Organization published an advisory. When redundancy fails, human redundancy must prevail. Crew coordination, resource management, and mental resilience are paramount. Airlines worldwide integrated these protocols, ensuring that every cockpit and cabin was primed for scenarios once deemed impossible. Back in Tokyo, Captain Sakamoto delivered keynote remarks at the annual Flight Safety Symposium. Under bright stage lights, he addressed pilots, engineers, and regulators alike. "We cannot control the sky, but we can control our response to its chaos." Flight 548 taught us that in the crucible of crisis, training becomes instinct, and instinct becomes salvation. Our legacy must not solely be the failures we fixed, but the culture of preparedness we forged together. First Officer Tanaka led workshops on communication when all lines are down, demonstrating how to use backup frequencies, manual transponder resets, and even signal lamps. Flight attendants like Nakamura toured global training centers, illustrating cabin management during compounded emergencies and reinforcing the mantra, "Service is safety." Meanwhile, the Noyo Delta platform retrofit its helipad to accommodate emergency airlifts, installing reinforced skins and approach lighting guidance akin to remote landing zones. Its operators developed joint drills with the U.S. Coast Guard, conducting mock rescue exercises that echoed the real-world scenario of Flight 548. Offshore workers, once accustomed to isolation, now trained as auxiliary first responders to aviation disasters. Personal legacies also bloomed. The teenage survivor who had whispered about the platform cat went on to become a marine biologist, advocating for wildlife safety around offshore installations. The honeymooners, whose relationship was tested by trauma, established a non-profit offering counseling for survivors of in-flight emergencies. The retired couple, an engineer and a nurse, taught community classes on emergency preparedness, emphasizing that ordinary individuals could spark extraordinary rescues. On the 5th anniversary of the incident, a memorial ceremony took place at Haneda Airport's new safety pavilion. A plaque bore the names of all 182 souls on Flight 548, marking those who taught us how to endure the impossible. As cranes lifted salvaged wreckage to be displayed behind reinforced glass, families and crew members gathered beneath cherry blossoms in bloom, symbolizing renewal. Captain Sakamoto, now promoted to training captain, placed his hand gently on the plaque's engraved metal. "We learned how to bend without breaking," he said. "May our lesson endure in every cockpit, every classroom, every heart." As petals drifted in the spring breeze, survivors and rescuers alike released lanterns upon a reflecting pond, tiny flames dancing on water, a tribute to lives saved and lessons learned. Each lantern carried a whispered vow that no matter how deep the silence, every voice would be heard, that no matter how vast the ocean, hope would remain a tether to shore. And so, the true story of Flight 548, the plane that disappeared without a trace, became not an epitaph of loss, but a legacy of light for all skies.